My grandfather's lakehouse in northern Ontario held a secret worth more than $2 million. And the night I found it, someone was already watching me from the tree line. I never expected to inherit anything. My grandfather, a retired provincial surveyor named Alec Drummond, had spent the last 22 years of his life alone on a 40-hectare property outside Temagami, about 4 hours north of Toronto. He wasn't the warm, cookie-baking type. He was the kind of man who sent Christmas cards with no signatures, just a name stamped in red ink at the bottom. Alec. Not Grandpa, not even Granddad, just Alec. When his lawyer called me on a Tuesday morning in late October, I was standing in a hardware store in Hamilton, pricing out floor underlayment for a bathroom renovation I couldn't really afford. She told me he'd passed quietly the previous Friday. Cardiac arrest, she said, which felt like a strange phrase. Cardiac arrest, as though his heart had simply been pulled over and told to stop. She told me he'd left the property to me. Only me. My mother called an hour later, furious. I'm her only son. She's the only child of Alec Drummond, and apparently, her father had skipped an entire generation and left his estate directly to me, bypassing her completely, with no explanation attached to the will, no letter, no recorded message. Just a signed document and a set of keys mailed to the lawyer's office in a manila envelope postmarked 4 months before he died. He planned this, my mother said. There was something tight in her voice, something that wasn't quite grief. He did this deliberately, Theo. That's my name. Theo Drummond. My mother kept her maiden name, which always made family gatherings confusing and a little sad. I told her I'd drive up and take a look. She told me not to bother, that the property was probably worth nothing, that I should list it with an agent and split the proceeds with her and walk away. She had a way of framing suggestions as instructions. I told her I'd think about it. Then I booked 3 days off work and drove north. The property was harder to find than the lawyer's directions suggested. My phone lost reception somewhere past South River, and the hand-drawn map the lawyer had included with the keys, an actual hand-drawn map on graph paper in pencil, became my only reference. My grandfather had apparently not trusted digital anything. The man had filed his land surveys by hand until the provincial office forced him to switch to electronic submission in 2008, and he'd submitted a formal written complaint about it that the office framed and hung in their break room as a joke. The driveway was a rutted dirt path cutting through second-growth boreal forest. Birch and black spruce pressed in from both sides, and the wet October leaves had turned the track into something closer to a creek bed. When I finally reached the clearing, I sat in my truck for a long moment and stared. The house wasn't what I expected. I'd been picturing a weathered A-frame, maybe a sagging dock, the kind of derelict charm that gets photographed for magazine features about rural Ontario. What I found was a squat, fortress-like structure built from heavy timber and poured concrete block, the kind of construction you might associate with a Cold War-era government installation. The windows were small and fitted with exterior security shutters, cranked shut. The roof was steel, painted dark green, nearly invisible against the surrounding canopy. A propane tank the size of a small car sat beside the north wall. There were no bird feeders, no garden, no rocking chairs on the porch. There was a dock. It extended about 12 meters into the lake, solid and freshly treated, which struck me as wrong somehow. The rest of the property looked neglected, but the dock looked like someone had maintained it last spring. Inside, the air smelled like mineral oil and old paper, and something I couldn't name right away. Something faintly chemical, the way the inside of a sealed toolbox smells after a long winter. The main room held a wood stove, a single armchair, a folding table, and bookshelves that ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls. The books themselves were strange. Not cottage reads, engineering manuals, survey methodology texts, volumes on Canadian property law and Crown land regulation, most of them heavily annotated in my grandfather's cramped handwriting. A shelf of federal topo maps, a shelf of water-resistant navigation charts. The second day, I started going through the filing cabinet in the small back room he'd used as an office. That's where I started to feel something shift, not the files themselves. Those were exactly what you'd expect. Decades of survey records, tax documents, the kind of bureaucratic accumulation that any methodical man builds up over a lifetime. What bothered me was the room's dimensions. I'm not a surveyor, but I grew up sketching floor plans for fun, and the back room felt short. Not dramatically short. Not movie set short. Just wrong by maybe 8 or 10 feet. The kind of discrepancy that you might convince yourself was an optical illusion if you didn't keep walking back to check. I went outside and measured the exterior wall with a tape measure I found in the truck. Then I went back inside and measured the interior. The numbers didn't reconcile. There was close to 3 meters of exterior wall length that corresponded to nothing on the inside. I stood in the narrow corridor that connected the office to the utility room and knocked on the interior wall. The sound was flat and heavy. Concrete, not wood framing. I knocked on the opposite wall, hollow, standard stud and drywall. I walked back and knocked on the concrete wall again. I spent the rest of that afternoon looking for a seam. I found it just before dark, behind the utility shelf that held his cleaning supplies. The shelf was bolted to the wall at 4 points, but when I ran my hand along the back edge, I felt a slight gap, maybe 3 millimeters, along the entire right side, floor to ceiling, like a door that had been painted over a few times. I unscrewed the shelf brackets. I pulled the unit away from the wall. Behind it was a door. Steel, gray primed, with a key cylinder lock and a simple lever handle. Nothing dramatic. It looked like a mechanical room door in an office building. One of the keys on the ring the lawyer had sent me fit the lock on the second try. The room beyond was dry and cool, and lit by a single fluorescent strip that flickered on automatically when I pushed the door open. It was roughly 3 meters by 4, its walls lined with sealed metal shelving units. A standalone dehumidifier sat in one corner, plugged into an outlet fed by a dedicated circuit. The dehumidifier was still running. Someone had filled the water reservoir recently enough that it hadn't overflowed. On the shelves, rows of archival document boxes, each labeled in my grandfather's hand. Beside them, a flat file cabinet, the wide, shallow kind used for storing drawings, and a heavy floor safe, the kind you'd bolt through a concrete pad, which this one was. Against the far wall, a pegboard held survey equipment, a transit level, a set of range poles, coils of survey flagging. It all looked legitimate. It looked like a working archivist's storeroom. Then I opened the first document box. The papers inside were not survey records. They were transaction logs, meticulously formatted, cross-referencing formulas, dollar amounts in Canadian and American currency, and a set of coded initials I didn't recognize. Some entries referenced numbered companies. Some referenced what looked like property PIN codes from the provincial land registry. The dates ran from 1987 through to 2019. I pulled out my phone. No signal. I'd known that since the first day. I drove back down the rutted track until I hit the paved road south of town, found 1 bar of LTE, and searched the numbered company from the first entry. The result loaded slowly. A CBC investigative piece from 2003. A provincial task force. A large-scale land fraud scheme in northern Ontario, involving falsified survey records, forged Crown land applications, and the illegal transfer of mineral rights on dozens of parcels across 4 districts. The scheme had been partially unraveled after a whistleblower came forward, but the investigators had never identified the person who had maintained the paper trail, the one who had quietly ensured that every fraudulent transaction had a technically legitimate-looking survey on file. My grandfather had been the surveyor of record on 14 of the flagged parcels. I sat on the side of the road in my truck until it got dark enough that I turned the headlights on. Then I drove back to the property because I didn't know where else to go. My mother arrived the next morning. I hadn't called her. She'd apparently been tracking my location through a family GPS app on her phone. An app I'd completely forgotten I'd agreed to when she'd guilted me into it 3 years earlier after I'd gotten caught in a snowstorm on the 400. She pulled up in her Subaru just as I was coming back from the lake with a mug of coffee, and she stepped out looking like she hadn't slept. "I need to see it," she said by way of greeting. "I know there's something in there." He didn't leave it to you because he loved you more than me, Theo. He left it to you because he needed someone young enough to handle whatever this is." I wasn't sure how to feel about that observation. I told her about the room. I showed her the transaction logs. I watched her face change as she read. Not with surprise exactly, but with the slow, controlled expression of someone confirming something they had always half suspected and never let themselves fully think. "The Hargreave parcels," she said quietly, touching one of the pages. "I didn't know what that meant. He mentioned them once," she said. "I was maybe 15. He was on the phone late at night, and I came downstairs for water, and I heard him say that name. When he saw me, he hung up immediately and told me to go back to bed. He'd never spoken to me that way before. I never asked about it." She set the page down. Then she looked at the floor safe. "Open it," she said. "I don't have the combination. Try his birthday." It wasn't his birthday. It wasn't my mother's birthday, or mine, or the year he'd retired. I was crouching in front of the safe trying dates when my mother, standing behind me, said quietly, "The year the surveying office made him switch to electronic. He submitted a complaint letter. Try 2008. It opened on 2008. Inside the safe, three things: a USB drive in a sealed plastic bag, a smaller set of document folders, rubber banded together, and a handwritten letter addressed to me. Not to my mother. To me, by name, in my grandfather's unmistakable cramped printing. I took the letter outside to read it. My mother didn't follow me, which was the kindest thing she'd done in years. He explained himself in 2 pages. He'd been recruited into the scheme in 1986. The letter said, by a man named only as the contractor, someone connected to a numbered holding company in Alberta. At the time, Alec had been young, recently licensed, and carrying debt from a divorce my mother never spoke about because it had predated her by 3 years. The contractor had offered him work that required only that he certify surveys he hadn't personally conducted, in exchange for payments made through a third party. He'd told himself it was a victimless arrangement. Crown land applications, mineral exploration parcels in regions nobody lived on, no houses demolished, no families displaced. By the time he understood what the mineral rights were actually financing, he'd been part of it for 6 years and knew too much to walk away cleanly. So he'd done the next best thing, the letter said. He'd kept records of everything, every transaction, every payment, every name that crossed his desk. He'd stored it out here, in a room no one knew about, in a property that would never be associated with the urban networks he'd been connected to. He'd been adding to it for 30 years. He'd been waiting for the right moment to surface it, but the right moment kept not arriving, and then his heart started giving him trouble in the spring, and he'd known he was out of time. He'd left it to me because, he wrote, my mother would burn it. He knew her. She would not want the family name attached to what was in those boxes. And she would make the pragmatic choice, the protective choice, and the records would be gone. He needed someone who didn't already know enough to be afraid. I sat on the dock for a long time after I finished reading. The lake was flat and gray and perfectly still. A pair of loons called from somewhere across the water, that sound that always makes Northern Ontario feel like the edge of the world. Then I went back inside. My mother was standing in the hidden room, holding one of the archival boxes. He documented everything, she said. She wasn't angry. She sounded exhausted. He wanted it turned over, I said. She set the box down very carefully. If we do that, she said, his name is in every news story for the next 2 years. Everything he built. His professional record. She paused. My professional record. I work in municipal planning, Theo. I use certified survey records every week. If it comes out that my father falsified them for 30 years. He didn't falsify them for 30 years, I said. He documented the fraud for 30 years. That's not how it will read. Maybe not, but it's what happened. We didn't speak for a while. Outside, something moved through the brush along the north side of the property, probably a deer, but in that moment, neither of us moved to check. My mother sat down on the concrete floor, with her back against the shelving. She looked, for the first time since I could remember, genuinely undone. Not performing exhaustion, not performing distress. Just tired. in the way that only an old truth can make you tired. "What's on the USB?" she asked finally. "I don't know yet." "Whatever it is," she said. "He put it in the safe separately. He wanted us to find it last." I borrowed the laptop from my truck. I'd brought it up to work on a quote in the evenings, and we opened the USB in the hidden room, sitting on the concrete floor with the dehumidifier humming in the corner. It was a single folder. Inside, scanned documents organized by year, but also, at the top level, a video file, dated 14 months ago. My grandfather's face filled the screen. He was sitting in the armchair I'd seen in the main room, in better light than the property usually got in October, so it had been filmed in summer. He looked older than I remembered him. Thinner, the skin of his neck loose, but his eyes were the same, sharp and watchful, and slightly impatient. He spoke for 11 minutes. He addressed the letter he'd written me. He addressed my mother by name, told her he was sorry, told her this was the only way he'd been able to think of that gave the records any chance of surviving intact, because he'd known that if he'd told her while he was still alive, she would have found a way to manage the situation, and the situation needed to not be managed. Then he gave the name of the contractor, a man named Philip Doust. I recognized the name from the Hargreave parcel documents, but I also recognized it from somewhere else, something more recent, and it took me almost a full minute of sitting on that concrete floor before I placed it. Philip Doust had been named the previous spring as a prospective nominee for a provincial regulatory board related to land development. The appointment hadn't been confirmed yet. It was still under review. I looked at my mother. She'd already taken her phone out. "I have signal in the main room," she said. "We didn't sleep that night." My mother sat at the folding table in the main room, making notes in a legal pad she'd found in her car, methodically listing what we had, what it documented, and what the chain of custody needed to look like to be usable. She was good at this, not because of anything corrupt, but because she genuinely understood how documentation worked in a planning context, how evidence got dismissed on procedural grounds, how to make something bulletproof before it went anywhere. She called a lawyer she knew in Toronto at 7 in the morning, a former colleague who now did regulatory compliance work. She didn't explain everything on the phone, just said she needed an urgent consultation about a whistleblower situation involving a provincial appointment currently under review. We drove down to a coffee shop in Temagami to use their Wi-Fi, and she sent a scan of the key transaction documents from the USB. The lawyer called back within 40 minutes. I won't walk through all of what followed, because most of it was slow and administrative and deeply unglamorous. The kind of process that looks nothing like television. There were meetings. There were NDAs considered and rejected. There were provincial investigators who drove up to the property and spent 2 days in that hidden room with a forensic archivist. There were conversations I wasn't present for, between my mother and people I never met. What I can tell you is that Philip Doust's appointment to the regulatory board was quietly withdrawn 6 weeks later, with no public explanation. The investigation that followed over the subsequent months resulted in a review of land title records across 3 northern districts. Several numbered companies were dissolved. A civil recovery process was initiated against the estates of 2 deceased individuals whose names appear in the archived records. My grandfather's name was not in the end in the news stories. The investigators determined that his role had shifted from participant to documenter early enough in the scheme, and that the records he'd preserved had been the primary basis for any meaningful accountability that was eventually possible. His surveyor's license was reviewed posthumously. His survey record was flagged in the provincial database with a notation, not a criminal flag, but a disclosure notation that would show up if anyone pulled those parcels. It was the most accurate possible accounting of what he'd actually done, which felt right to me, even if it wasn't comfortable. I kept the property. My mother and I talked about selling it. We talked about it twice, seriously, with an agent's number written on a piece of paper between us. But both times, we ended up not making the call. I've been up there 4 times since. I repaired the dock, which turned out not to need much work, Just some new decking boards and fresh end caps. I took the security shutters off the windows. The place gets decent light in the afternoons when the sun comes through the gap the lake makes in the tree line. The hidden room is empty now. The investigators took everything. The floor safe sits open. The dehumidifier still runs. I keep meaning to unplug it. My grandfather was a surveyor his whole life. His job was to measure things accurately and put them on record. I've thought a lot about what it must have cost him to spend 30 years being accurate about the wrong things, filing away the truth in a sealed room in the bush, waiting for the right person to open it. He chose me because he thought I wouldn't flinch. I'm not sure that was true exactly. I flinched plenty, but I didn't burn it. I think, in the end, that's all he needed. If you found out that someone in your family had been hiding a secret like this, something that could bring down powerful people but also expose your own name, would you have turned it in or protected the family? Let me know in the comments. And if you've been listening along to this one, I'd really appreciate a like. It helps more than you'd think. We'll see you next time.